to thank the task force for making a commitment. I remember last year, former executive director Matt Foreman, pledged that the LGBT movement needed to do more about HIV/AIDS and recommit to that. And so I'm glad to see in this year's plenary, but also in many of the workshops that GMHC and CHAMP, Community HIV/AIDS Mobilization Project, helped plan, have also helped sort of move us in that direction. So I'm going to go back. In 1991, nearly 18 years ago, I was 15 years old when my mother, who was working 13-hour days and 6 days a week in Cleveland, Ohio, sat me and my two sisters down in front of the television to watch history. Now, it wasn't unusual for her to do that. We had always been made to sit down and watch things like Eyes on the Prize, the entire series about the civil rights movement, and look for snapshots of my uncle behind MLK at different points. We also had to watch How the West Was Lost, the documentary about white American expansion into the Americas, quote unquote, and the genocide that ensued of First Nations peoples. And I think my mother wanted us to get a sense of the range of history that's not told about our country, and perhaps because we weren't learning it in Cleveland, which was one of the worst public school districts in the country. But that night in 1991, my mother, after several right-wing senators like Jesse Helms and Arlen Specter tried to protect, quote-unquote, American families from being able to view it on public television, my mother sat us in front of the television to watch Marlon Riggs' breakthrough film on black gay men, Tongues Untied. This year is the 20th anniversary of that film. In the film and the poetry of the men in the film, particularly Essex Hempel, was for me an example of the possibility of black gay life, of an aesthetic and of a radical sex positive and pro-feminist politic. They were, quite literally, the men of my own dreams. Though they would both make more films, more books, both of them would be dead of HIV-related causes by 1995, within 1 year of each other, and just short of the first antiretrovirals to hit the market. And what is also sort of sad to me is I'm glad to hear the applause. And there are some people in this room who have forgotten their names and who may not even know who they are. But despite their examples, as two of the many people who spent the late 80s and early 1990s literally writing us into the history of the planet while they themselves were being dragged from the face of it, we have largely lost the layered, nuanced, multi-issue nature of their brilliant work, which very clearly demonstrates the social conditions of working class, black, queer life in the context of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Theirs was not a politics of inclusion, but a politic of sexual liberation in a decidedly black gay context. These men and many others who died from HIV or from violence were not only cultural workers, but in fact movement-minded folks, started and ran organizations, made political alliances with black lesbian organizations, other radical third world people of color, artists and organizers, multiracial white inclusive organizations as well. And despite their work that gave the public health world and the mainstream LGBT movement a body of work with which to fashion ideas around the context of HIV/AIDS among men, quote-unquote, men who have sex with men, instead of looking to that work for insight and inspiration, we've built a public health, black and or LGBT movement response to HIV/AIDS among black men who have sex with men with the decidedly ignorant assumption that we don't know what's going on with black MSM and that there is no black queer leadership that currently exists or could not be further nurtured and developed. A few numbers. Despite major advances in treating the HIV/AIDS virus, the epidemic is still very much with us. The CDC released the new incidence data from 2006, which showed that they've been projecting before about 15 years 40,000 infections per year, when that number was in fact 56,000 infections, back calculating over the 15 years between 1991 to 2006. Not only have we been undercounting the growth of the epidemic among men who have sex with men, and that is a public health category which includes gay and bisexual men and transgender women. But that group continued to bear the greatest infections, increases in new infections. In 2006, 53% of all infections were among quote-unquote MSM. I also want to add that when you look particularly at communities of color, Latino communities, people of African descent, indigenous First Nation communities, that though we have disproportionate rates of HIV, we have generally similar or fewer rates of individual risk behavior, which bucks the notions about how the virus is being in fact transmitted. And though trans women are counted in the MSM category, some data has shown that black male to female trans women have an HIV prevalence rate of 56%. So what is to be done? I'm sure our panelists will talk a little bit about what's happening with the National AIDS Strategy, some particular policy pieces that we want to see happen, and that will certainly help us in terms of impacting the epidemic. But I want to speak to us about this particular movement and this particular room of folks in this time and what we can perhaps be doing differently as a movement. First and foremost, the time where we can pretend that there is no viable, credible, or visible black or other people of color, queer leadership is over. We certainly need to be developing leaders, but leadership per se is not the problem. We have lots of leaders, and particularly in black gay communities, we have leaders who are running HIV prevention organizations all across the country, but the problem is that many of those leaders don't have a base that they're accountable to. Because of the little black LGBT infrastructure that exists, largely due in part to the HIV/AIDS service delivery, we are able to reach lots of people in our organizations as clients, but rarely are folks engaged as potential leaders, organizers, and members, in fact, of our organizations. We need the investment of both progressive philanthropy and LGBT funders to build the capacity and infrastructure of organizations to move from service delivery to also doing community organizing, leadership development, and base building. And lastly, as long as white-led mainstream LGBT movement is invested in seeing itself as the only credible leadership, or its organizations are the only ones doing the real work or having real impact, we will continue to invisibilize the work that black and other POC-led organizations are doing on the ground in spite of real material obstacles. So every time the gay news media and organizations promote these notions of the gay community versus the black community, black queers will continue to remain invisible, and assumes also that black queer people are not engaging in battles against homophobia and transphobia in the black community, which in and of itself is a fight against HIV/AIDS. Phrases like the Advocate's recent article, "Gay is the New Black," which has surfaced in T-shirts in neighborhoods as well, is racist, dangerous, and ignores the reality despite having a black president, black people in America continue to suffer a vast array of health and socioeconomic disparities, even when you control for all other factors. Not only that, it also, once again, presumes that to be LGBT or T or queer, to be identified as such, is to be white and to often be male. Just yesterday at this conference, a major figure in the same-sex marriage movement told a young queer person of color that there are some people in our community who are fit to lobby and some who are fit to sing and dance. These kinds of comments are just simply disgusting, particularly since many people of color and transgender people in white gay male spaces are only allowed to do as much. The sad thing is, for many people of color in this movement, the line between being asked by white organizations to lobby or to sing and dance is far too thin. So in closing, I think a lot about Marlon Riggs, I think about Essex Temple, I think about Barbara Smith, I think about Audre Lorde, I think about many others, and many other artists and organizers and activists who have led the way for me to be able to stand here on this stage. And it seems sad to me that in my work as a writer and here with the task force and my work with Queers for Economic Justice, that my comrades in this room from many organizations and movements across the country, that I'm having to make these arguments that they had been arguing for decades. And we can have all the policy wish list items and services around HIV met, I think we'll get there, but not without movement building from the grassroots of people most vulnerable to serve as a place where real change happens. And so long as there is no cure found, we will not see an end to the epidemic and the disproportionate impact it has on people of African descent globally. I would hope that after the decades of efforts to make visible the work of Black LGBT or queer people engaged directly or indirectly related to HIV/AIDS, that not another person has to stand here decades from now having to justify or make visible that work over and over again. We are beyond the point of benign ignorance or neglect. The bodies in this room and the graveyards many of us are carrying on our backs tell a different story, and so now should we. Thank you.